Hello and welcome. I'm Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the IISS, and I'd like to welcome you all to this IISS conflict briefing webinar. The title of the webinar is Lawless Seas, Contested Shores, Piracy, Smuggling, and the Scramble for Port Access in the Horn of Africa. It's prompted by the recent publication of our research paper of the same name, but also, of course, by the continuing upheavals that we witness in the region. So our discussions today will cover the political turbulence and security situation in Somalia, how that is affected by and affecting developments in the rest of the Horn of Africa, and of course, how it's impacting others in the area and beyond, but also with the elements included of the dynamics unfolding at sea and in the heightened competition for port and basing access. These are both symptoms, but also, I think, drivers of everything that we are seeing unfolding. Anyway, I'm merely the master of ceremonies for this event. I have an array of subject matter expertise in an excellent panel of colleagues, and they will be taking the main burden of the discussion here. They are Edward Beales, who is Research Analyst for Defence and Military Analysis for IISS Europe, Wolf Christian Pace, who's Associate Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development and Middle East Programs at the IISS, and then Dan Watson, Dr. Dan Watson, who's a Research Associate for Conflict, Security and Development, also with the Institute. They'll be kicking off with about 5 to 10 minutes of opening remarks on their particular areas of focus, and then it will be open to those of you in the audience online to join the discussion period. To do so, to make your interventions, please use the option of the question and answer box and put your questions, write your questions, preferably with an association and identification, and we will come to you when we come to that part of the proceedings. But for the time being, I am going to hand over now first to Edward, who is going to kick off proceedings for the substance of the discussion. So, Edward, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. If we could bring up the PowerPoint, please. So to set the scene, I'm going to give an overview of some of the challenges facing Somalia, which helps to explain the rise, but also the country's vulnerability to maritime security threats. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So in Somalia, the main tensions can be understood as located firstly within the federal state system. So the federal system is based on a central government in Mogadishu alongside several member states with substantial devolved powers. So some Somali states are increasingly aligning against the Somali federal government, that's the SFG, including the semi-autonomous state of Puntland and the state of Jubaland, which you can see in the top right and bottom left of the map respectively. So these tensions are over issues including notably constitutional and electoral reform, as well as tensions over the perceived centralization of power in Mogadishu, alongside chronic corruption and insecurity, which Dan is going to touch on later. So secondly, involving insurgencies. So these are including Al-Shabaab, which is particularly present in southern and central Somalia, including in Jubaland and around Mogadishu. So Al-Shabaab is marked in orange on the map, and the Islamic State Somalia province, so the ISSP, which is present in Puntland, and they're marked in purple on the map. So now to provide some important background on each of these non-state armed groups. So firstly, Al-Shabaab is a Salafi jihadist organization that seeks to overthrow the FGS, expel foreign forces, and establish an Islamic State governed by its extremist interpretation of Sharia law. It envisions in uniting all Somali-speaking areas, so including parts of Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya, although a smaller subset of militants pursues broader jihadist ambitions in coordination with al-Qaeda. So attacks beyond Somalia's borders, such as in Ethiopia and Kenya, have been framed as retaliation against military interventions and injustices against Muslims globally. So most of its recruits are from Somalia, and many, though not all, enlist voluntarily and are motivated by financial gain and propaganda, focusing on, for example, collective punishments from governments against Muslims and trainings. The group also forcibly conscripts civilians, including children. So in terms of its organizational structure, Al-Shabaab maintains a centralized hierarchical structure under the leadership of Ahmed Diriyeh. The group remains cohesive with no substantiated evidence of infighting, and it operates with near impunity across significant portions of central and southern Somalia, governing most rural areas as well as some administrative capitals and provincial towns. So this takes place through a combination of coercion, administrative control, and strategic service provision, as well as enforcing justice and dispute resolution. It exploits weaknesses in state governance, and this is sometimes done in conjunction with clan structures. So Al-Shabaab also provides security and regulates economic and social life. For example, the group bans unregistered weapons, certain imports, and environmentally harmful practices, including deforestation and charcoal production. So its governance remains entrenched and is sometimes more functional than that of the state. Financially, the group generates an estimated 100 to 200 million US dollars annually through taxation, extortion, money laundering, and smuggling. By the end of 2025, Al-Shabaab had overturned most of the FGS's gains from the landmark 2022 to 23 offensive, so the group has retaken key towns in central Somalia and some areas closer to the capital. In doing so, it has relinked its presence in central Somalia to its heartland in southern Somalia. So the number of al-Shabaab fighters is estimated to have increased to between 10,000 and 18,000 in 2025, compared to between 7,000 and 12,000 in 2022. And this could suggest that al-Shabaab is increasing as a threat, which I'd be happy to provide more of an assessment on in the Q&A. So turning now to ISSP, this is a Salafi jihadist organization ideologically aligned with the Islamic State. So the group pursues a transnational Islamic caliphate governed by a hardline interpretation of Sharia law and views the caliph's obligation to wage offensive jihad as central to its mission. So under the Islamic State's vision of a worldwide caliphate, the ISSP aspires to conquer territory beyond Bari, Puntland, and Somalia, with arrests linked to external plots made in the US, Sweden, and Italy in recent years. The ISSP also broadens its base through coercion and propaganda. So, in terms of its organizational structure within the wider Islamic State, the ISSP is overseen and managed by the Al-Qara Regional Office, which is one of several offices under the General Directorate of Provinces, that's the GDP. Al-Qara's scope includes all of Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa. Exact leadership structures remain opaque, with Abdul Qadir Mumin as the head of Al-Qara office and the likely head of ISSP. It's speculated that Mu'in may have been elevated to the global caliph of the Islamic State, though this remains unverified. So in general, the ISSP's leadership is dominated by figures from Puntland clans. However, over half of the group's members are foreign fighters. So these recruits originate from Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, North Africa, Sudan, and Tanzania, as well as the Somali diaspora, Syria, and Yemen. And the ISSP maintains only a limited territorial presence, concentrated primarily in camps and cave networks across the Al Misad Mountains in Puntland's Bari, with little control over populated areas. So financially, the ISSP reportedly amassed over 6 million US dollars between 2022 and 2024. This is through illegal taxation, kidnap for ransom, and smuggling. The group has also been linked to gold exports from Bari and the use of cryptocurrencies to conceal transfers, and it has funneled these funds to other IS provinces and affiliates, emerging as a major financial hub, although counter-terrorism efforts have since disrupted parts of this network. So indeed, by late 2025, the ISSP had suffered severe operational setbacks, with Puntland's operational Hilak dismantling most of the ISSP's leadership havens in the Ain Miscal Mountains, and Puntland officials claiming degradation of up to 95% of the group's capabilities in September 2025. So the ISSP had between 600 and 800 fighters in late 2022, but Puntland officials have claimed that many have been subdued 1 year later. And this could suggest that the ISSP has decreased as a threat, which I'd also be happy to provide more of an assessment on in the Q&A. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass over to Wolf Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edward, Nick. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of maritime dimension of this conflict, and maybe by way of history, what really got us interested into doing this report a couple of months ago is, in fact, that we've done a previous report about a year ago looking at the Houthi naval campaign against commercial shipping. Some of you, I'm sure, attended the webinar or are aware of the report that we did. I think it came out in January 2025. And what struck us at the team is the fact that there was sort of an uptick of piracy shortly after the start of the Houthi campaign. And there was a lot of speculation at the time in the media among international sort of community members whether this was a coordinated effort, whether the pirates were basically either cooperating with Houthis or whether maybe Iran was pulling strings in Somalia, given that there is indeed a relationship between Iran and certain groups in Somalia that is well established. And we were trying to basically get a handle on this, right? I mean, how much substance was there to these claims? So we had a bit of a look into the maritime security picture. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what you see here is basically, a map of Somali piracy attacks on ships in our main reporting period, which is November 23 and until April 2025. The Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea started also in November 2023. And the first successful attack was on the motor vessel Ren in mid-December 2023. And this was actually the first successful attack, first recorded piracy attack of this scope since 2017. So clearly that was relevant. And we did a fair bit of research trying to understand the dynamic here, talk to industry sources, naval sources, risk consultancies, and the like. And we also organized a workshop that some of you attended in Berlin late last year looking into this issue. And the picture that is emerging is not one of a coordinated approach between the Houthis and the Somali pirates, but it's a lot more opportunistic than that. So yes, there is a coincide in terms of timelines, but we're fairly convinced that this is less due to some sort of really coordinated effort and has more to do with the fact that attention was elsewhere, right? The limited international naval presence in those waters was elsewhere engaged. The focus shifted to the Red Sea, and the pirates saw an opportunity. And what really seems to underline this point from an evidence point of view is that the piracy logic is really different, right? I mean, what the Houthi are trying to do in the maritime domain is they want to scare away traffic. I mean, that's the whole point. They want to put political pressure on what countries that they perceive to be allies to Israel because of the conflict in Gaza. And they basically want no more Western quote unquote shipping through the Bab el Mandab and the southern Red Sea. Now, the piracy logic, of course, is entirely different. The pirates live off hijacking ships, holding the crew ransom, and then basically collecting ransom money from the shipping line, something they did very successfully during the heyday of Somali piracy in the early 2000s. And we had a couple of successful cases also in this new sort of period starting about 2 years ago. And so no more ships would actually not be very good from a piracy point of view, right? What the Houthis do is naval terrorism, literally, right? I mean, they want to project terror and tell people, don't go here. We don't want you here for political reasons. And the pirates want, well, ships to come and be preferably not terribly well protected, and then be able to take them ransom. What's also quite interesting is that the piracy resurgence, if we can call it that, of November to 23 to sort of early 25, has leveled off, right? So, I mean, we actually have a couple of diagrams in the report that look at the numbers, and you can see there was a spike between November and February 23. And it's been a lot more quiet ever since. That has possibly to do with shipping lines taking more defensive measures. As most of you will be aware, there's BMP5 best management practices, which mean that you take armed guards on board for certain crossings. That you have barbed wire, make it harder for people to board your ship. That you have a SOP to withdraw into the citadel of the ship in case of a boarding and all of that. And it seems very likely that the resurgence has to do with the fact that, well, navies were elsewhere engaged, and that shipping lines had gotten a little bit lax in terms of their adherence to BMP5. That's at least what we're hearing from the industry, and that this has then facilitated the resurgence of piracy. Now, moving on, the second aspect that we're looking at in the report is smuggling, in particular smuggling of weapons. Maybe we can move to the next chart for this. This is actually a chart that is from a previous report. This is from our January 2025 Houthi Red Sea report. And it looks at smuggling patterns both to the Houthis and between Iran, Somalia, and Yemen. And as you can see here, there has been a well-established arms trafficking pattern that actually pre-existed the 2023 situation. And what we've been able to document is that ships have been coming from Irani ports, ports like Bandar Abbas and others, have been going to the northern Somali coastline, basically the coastline of Somaliland and Puntland, and either going to ports like Bosaso, or going to basically staying in the territorial waters of Somalia or just outside of the territorial waters, and you would then have transshipment towards Yemen. So that's a dynamic that has been well documented since, say, 2013 is the first case where we have really strong evidence for it. And the last known case, I think, was in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. So it's clearly a pattern that is still alive, or has been alive as recently as 2 years ago. Now, the interesting question is, of course, if the weapons are really geared for the Houthis, if they're meant to go to the Houthis, why do you go via Somalia? Why don't you go directly? And here the answer is, and I think that brings us then to one of the main points of our reports, that Somali waters are notoriously poorly patrolled, right? No, Somalia has a very, very long coastline, has, of course, very weak governance structures, and Edward spoke already a little bit about that. I think Dan will also speak a little bit more about that. That makes it very difficult, even at the best of times, to patrol all these waters, and makes it particularly difficult then if you have political fragmentation and several insurgencies going on at the same time. And this is creating the conditions both for piracy and for smuggling of arms, but also smuggling of migrants, illicit commodities, and any other kind of activity going on there. So there has been a well-established smuggling route going from Iran via Somalia to Yemen, and there's also been a very well-established smuggling route out of Yemen towards the Horn of Africa. Now, that is not just Somalia, that is also, of course, Eritrea, Sudan, possibly quite down all the way down to Kenya. The reason for that is just that there's a lot of weapons in Yemen, right? So the prices for guns are actually significantly higher in the Horn of Africa than they are in Yemen, just a function of supply and demand. Even before the Civil War, Yemen had the highest sort of number of guns per head of population in that part of the world, whereas the numbers are actually quite a bit lower in the Horn of Africa. And as a result of that, businessmen, if we can call it that, arms brokers, have been exploiting that dynamic for decades. What is changing, though, or where there's some indications, and that's the final point I wanted to make before handing over to Dan, is that since late 2023, there's some indications of cooperation between the Houthis and jihadi groups in Somalia. And again, this is an issue like the resurgence of piracy that is much discussed in international circles, but fully understood. Um, a lot of this goes back to a report of the UN monitoring group of Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, I think from mid 2023, where they for the first time stated that there had been high-level meetings regarding cooperation between the Houthis and Al-Shabaab specifically. There wasn't a lot of evidence in that report, but that then triggered a series of reports and people looking more closely. The pattern that is emerging, as far as we can tell, is that indeed there have been talks, even though there's still lots of questions about when and where and how, and that there seems to be a certain number of sort of Somalis going to Yemen, possibly to receive military training. Again, we know that people from Somalia have been going in groups to Yemen. What exactly they did there is a bit less clear, and that they quite possibly by now are also sort of Houthi affiliated people inside of Somalia, possibly providing military training and others. Again, hard evidence is hard to come by, but I mean, there's a lot of smoke in that direction. What we have not seen, thankfully, so far, is the transfer of advanced weaponry. Like the kind of weapons that have been going from Yemen to Somalia in recent years have been small arms and light weapons, ammunition, explosives, all of which is dangerous enough. But we're not talking about ballistic missiles or advanced drones that would allow you to target a target over 300 kilometers or something like that, right? That kind of equipment has not been seen in Somalia yet, even though there's a lot of discussion about whether these transfers might be happening in the future. Yeah, and I mean, with that, I would hand over to Dan if he's with us. Dan?
Hello, yes, I am. So thank you so much for these great presentations so far. So I'm going to talk about some of the internal fault lines in Somalia and how these might interact with external tensions and agendas that are playing out across the region, particularly in wake of Israel's recognition of Somaliland and the increasingly explicit power struggle that seems to be unfolding between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So before I start, I think it's just important to acknowledge that the the issue of Somaliland is a particularly sensitive one, and some of the discourse and discussion about Somaliland has become increasingly polarized over the last few weeks. So I'd like to emphasize that we are not coming down on any one side here, but we are keen to analyze these recent developments that relate to Somaliland and understand their current geopolitical significance. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Um, so I'd like to go through some of the background issues that represent potential points of convergence with these geopolitical tensions. So internally, Somalia has been beset by mounting political disputes, some of which Edward mentioned earlier. And these disputes have been sharpened by upcoming elections, as well as recent developments linked to Israel's decision to formally extend recognition to Somaliland. Elections have become a ticking clock. In theory, elections would need to occur before mid-May 2026 in order to avoid a risky unilateral extension of President Hassan Sheikh's term. However, the presidency's attempt to shift from an electoral college model, which is more indirect, to a one person, one vote system has caused tensions. And this change would affect parliamentary elections, though parliamentarians would still choose the president this was a concession by Mogadishu from earlier proposals. But the modality of these elections has become a point of division, particularly with Puntland and Jubaland in particular. This may weaken the ability of certain member states to choose their own politicians to send to Mogadishu. And there are also concerns about the feasibility of preparing for and conducting elections on the proposed basis, given the short time frame, logistical complications, lack of preparation, and the security situation. But in particular, Jubaland and Puntland, or rather political elites from these regions, are concerned that this move will further centralize power under President Hassan Sheikh and fear that the incumbent will be able to influence processes surrounding elections. Now, Somaliland has represented a fault line that has at times been dormant, but has become an increasingly live issue. For those who don't know, Somaliland is a self-declared republic that was created in 1991 following a vicious counterinsurgency campaign in what was then northwestern Somalia. And it had previously been a British colony that merged with Italian Somalia in 1961 in a referendum where the majority of Somalilanders did not actually vote to join Somalia, but the overall vote was for unification. Now, since 1991, Somaliland has become a de facto state that has generally been relatively stable, at least compared to South Central Somalia, but has had issues with political instability and security tensions to a lesser extent in the western part of the country, but in particular in the eastern edge with Puntland. The issue of Somaliland status is a particularly sensitive one, given the African Union's general opposition to border changes, and in particular due to the position of the federal government of Somalia that only recognises Somaliland as a federal member state and not as an independent country. However, several countries maintain informal relations with Somaliland authorities. This situation has been further complicated since 2023. So, following fighting in and around the town of Las Khanod, a new political unit known as SSC Khatumo was created in the eastern region of that territory, claimed by Somaliland, in an area which is also claimed by Puntland. And this has become a focal point this has been a focal point for sporadic conflicts over the last 25 years or so. This area has now been rebranded as Northeastern State by Mogadishu, who have recognized the area as a new federal member state. And this move has antagonized relations with both Somaliland and Puntland. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Overlaid onto these issues are a number of slow-burning processes relating to maritime security and strategic interests in controlling commercial ports and naval bases along the Somali coast, as well as other parts of northeastern Africa. These processes have recently begun to accelerate and represent a point where conflict and security issues in the Gulf and the Horn of Africa are converging. The region's maritime infrastructure is a patchwork of different zones of influence in which the UAE occupies an important role. The accumulation of commercial and military ports has enabled the UAE to expand its power across vital shipping lanes that run through the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. And Abu Dhabi has begun to invest in ports along Somalia's Indian Ocean shoreline, notably in Kismayo. However, the UAE has also fallen out with host governments over various matters over the years. In the past year, Saudi Arabia has also become increasingly active in Djibouti with regards to maritime infrastructure. Now, these geopolitical interactions, they are lopsided, but they are not one-sided. So national and regional governments, as well as elites and other kind of key players, have sought to steer these developments to their own advantage or block developments that threaten their interests. Cumulatively, these dynamics have tended to generate intense speculation and predictions about geopolitical confrontations, particularly whenever there's been a shift in countries announced that it's going to be building a port or is pursuing that access, or a deal has been severed. Now, in part, well, I would say that there's often a need for caution here because a lot of the time these predictions about conflict or regional conflagrations don't usually come to pass, or at least not quite in the ways that are predicted. And in part, this is because ports can take a very long time to develop, and there are risks of being too kind of analytically reliant on public statements or speculation regarding investments decisions or political or military intentions. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, it's not clear at present whether the recent discord linked to Israeli recognition of Somaliland and the effective expulsion of the UAE from Somalia represents a new phase in these dynamics, or is instead a more intense version of existing rivalries and disputes. There has been a lot of information circulating which is unverified, and some caution is required when trying to decipher this information or when trying to determine or interpret events. So Israel's motivations seem mainly to be focused on security, particularly with regards to Yemen and maritime insecurity threats. However, apparent cooperation or coordination with the UAE suggests or implies possible anti-Saudi or anti-Turkey motivations as well. The recognition of Somaliland has been denounced by various international organizations and bodies, as well as China, the UK, and other states, although US criticism has been fairly muted. And there's a widespread perception that the UAE has supported or potentially coordinated Israel's recognition of Somaliland, which is a contributing factor to Mogadishu's decision to annul agreements with the UAE, in addition to events involving the STC in Yemen. Now, there are several dimensions to this widening rift in the region between Saudi Arabia and the UAE that begins in the Gulf but is playing out in the Horn of Africa. But this partly relates to the UAE's willingness to engage with internationally unrecognized states, as well as non-state armed groups and partition states. This creates friction with Riyadh and several other regional players who tend to work through existing state infrastructures rather than creating new ones. Tensions between the UAE and several regional powers, including Egypt, Turkey, and especially Saudi Arabia, now appear to be escalating to a point where these rival states are taking concerted steps to dismantle the UAE's political, security, and economic networks in the region. And how Abu Dhabi responds remains to be seen. It's also unclear whether opponents will undertake more limited or more targeted action, or instead increase their involvement in other parts of the region where the UAE is influential, including in highly unstable countries such as Sudan. Um, Sudan is particularly important because, in addition to being a major armed conflict in its own right, it is an area where the UAE can exert much more military influence than in, say, Yemen. And the present geography of the Sudanese conflict risks pulling in neighboring states, notably South Sudan and the UAE, both of whom are aligned. Sorry, both South Sudan and Ethiopia, both of whom are aligned with the UAE. Although there is a high risk for several of these political and military conflicts to converge, this does not necessarily mean that events will unfold in a linear fashion, nor that the alignment of one country in the Horn with either the UAE or Saudi Arabia will automatically mean that it will enter a regional conflagration on the side of its patron. Now, historically, regional conflict in the Horn has tended to be clustered around contested border areas or flashpoints near to borders, taking the form of proxy warfare or other forms of destabilization. And this has helped to contain conflicts. However, if a country fully commits to militarily intervening in another country, this is where things can become increasingly uncontrolled. And those are some of the stakes at play here. Could we just go on to my last slide, please? Thank you. Now, the risk is that regional developments will lead to a more politically fractured and militarized Horn, although this is likely to follow along the lines of pre-existing disputes and fault lines. In addition, although Mogadishu's relations with Abu Dhabi have been turbulent over the years, the UAE has provided support for some military operations against al-Shabaab, whilst also covering some Somali military expenditures, such as training and salaries. So there's a risk to some of the issues that Edward was talking about earlier with regards to counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Now, I just want to conclude by talking about several things to watch out for, some of which I'll touch on in more depth, some of which I'll skip over simply in the interest of time, but we can return in the Q&A. So I think it's important to watch for signs of a shift in how Ethiopia engages with Somalia, and this is due to important links Ethiopia has with all concerned parties, including member states within Somalia. Currently, Ethiopia has been quiet. But in the event that the UAE escalates its involvement in the Horn to try and rebuild its influence, Ethiopia will likely be the state that they work through, even though Ethiopia does historically act with a higher degree of autonomy than other states in the region. Next, delays in Somalia's elections or abandonment of proposed electoral reform. So far, there is not a clear commitment to meaningful concessions from Mogadishu to repair relations with Jubaland or Puntland, and there are concerns that President Hassan Sheikh will exploit the Israeli recognition of Somaliland as a pretext for extending his term. If a unilateral term extension occurs without buy-in from current opponents, then this has the potential to kind of increase the political temperature and risk opening rifts within the security sector. Now, for Puntland, much depends on whether the unconfirmed reports regarding UAE withdrawals from the state are accurate and whether a power vacuum is left in the wake of any withdrawal. It's also conceivable that the Islamic State Somalia province forces might be able to benefit from the political turbulence created by these events. Finally, a focal point of conflicts may be this disputed northeastern state. President Hassan Sheikh travelled to the state capital for an inauguration event on 16th of January, which was reportedly attended by representatives from within the region, as well as Chinese and Turkish ambassadors, amid a flurry of nationalistic rhetoric. This area risks becoming a flashpoint for tensions between Somalia and Somaliland, and also for disputes between Puntland and Mogadishu. Now, there are clear limits to Mogadishu's power, and there may be constraints in its ability to project force in this area, but a proxy conflict is on the cards. Overall, the outcome of these developments is unpredictable. Many analysts are focusing on tensions between the Saudi and Emirati-led blocs, but it's important to remember that these blocs are really more alignments than alliances and may not be especially durable. Several states are also engaged in a balancing act with various other external partners, and any Gulf rivalries will be refracted through those existing commitments, as well as the shifting and complex politics of the Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks also to Edward and Wolf Christian for navigating us through all the cross currents on land and at sea that we are witnessing and are increasingly grabbing attention, I think. We now have about 20 minutes left to turn to the question and answer session, the discussion session of this event. And just as a reminder, if you want to put a question to the panelists, then do write it up in the under the question and answer function, and I will distribute accordingly. If you are particularly focusing on one of the panelists or it's a general question to the panel, then please try and indicate that as well. So I encourage you to do that now. We'll start with one question from Ika Leplo, who asks, do either Al-Shabaab or ISSP also operate in the maritime domain? And from Sertak Rumel Lioglu, why has the Horn become a geopolitical battleground? I'd also like to throw in a question myself, as Al-Shabaab has been mentioned a few times and resonates as an issue beyond the region as well. My question would be essentially, do we have to regard Al-Shabaab as a rising and increasing threat? And what does that mean in terms of how things may unfold on the ground? Maybe forgive me if I were to point the first question on Al-Shabaab, ISSP, and the maritime to Wolf Christian, the geopolitical one specifically to Dan, and the Al-Shabaab, my Al-Shabaab question to Edward. But if each of you has a contribution to make to any of those elements, please do chip in. Wolf Christian, maybe if you want to kick off this section.
Sure. So I mean that's really a complex question. I mean the short answer is no. Neither Al-Shabaab nor the Islamic State province of Somalia have been active in the maritime domain. If we mean by being active that they've used, that they've never carried out any naval attacks, as far as we can tell. Historically, also what is quite interesting, of course, is that during the decade where sort of Somali pirates were very much an international concern, right? The early 2000s, Al-Shabaab was actually making statements about suppressing piracy, right? I mean, they weren't really doing much, and there was obviously a live and let live attitude, but at least rhetorically, Al-Shabaab was not coming out in favor of piracy, and the pirates are not terrorists in the sense of that they being ideologically driven, right? They're driven by a motivation of making cash and of course desperation of living under very destitute circumstances. Now, the longer answer, though, is that, of course, there are maritime dimension to it. So what we do know is that both Al-Shabaab and ISSP members are suspected to have been traveling across to Yemen on small boats, skiffs, fishing vessels, small dhows. There have been a series of reports in this regard over the years, so this is not a new development. This is not something that just started in 2023. What makes it very hard to track this is that there's a migration pattern from Somalia to Yemen. So a lot of people from the Horn basically move to Yemen for reasons of labor migration, right? They try to make it to Saudi Arabia to work. And because a lot of these people are then ethnic Somalis or Ethiopians, it's not always easy to tell. Are these migrants trying to looking for better life in the Gulf, or might they be terrorists? And I mean, I remember, back in my previous life, sometimes I got like snippets of intelligence saying, oh, there's another small vessel with 40 suspected terrorists on their way from somewhere in Puntland or Somaliland to Yemen. And it rarely got more concrete than that. At the very best, you had some sort of pictures of a lot of African migrants, young men usually, who indeed may have gone to a terrorist training camp or might have been just on the way to illegal migration in the Gulf. But yes, there's a pattern, right? So indeed, undoubtedly, members of both groups have been using the sea to travel to Yemen and beyond. And there's also a reverse pattern of weapons going the other way. Now, is that really Al-Shabaab organizing the arms smuggling? I have some doubts, right? Because what we know is that there's a lot of sort of private business, but at least neither group has a history of carrying out maritime attacks. Let's put it this way, and at least verbally, they've taken some distance of these attacks. Is it possible that this could change over time? Yes, absolutely. We need to be aware that AQAP, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, seems to have attempted attacks in the maritime domain in the early 2020s. So, I mean, there was a string of attacks around 2020, 2021. And it seems like at some stage they established a camp in the Maha governorate in Yemen. using some of the tactics that the Houthis have been using, sort of drone boats and all of that against shipping, including a British vessel, as a matter of fact, that was attacked at some stage. Um, but there's very little known about this. But I mean, so it's not inconceivable that they might take this up at some stage, right? If they see a value, but so far they've not done it, as far as we can tell.
Thanks, Wolf Christian. Dan, I don't know if you can pick up the geopolitical question.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so the region has historically been a battleground, particularly since the Cold War, and there are a number of reasons for this, some of which date back to colonialism, some regional rivalries, particularly relating to Ethiopia, but in particular the tendency for the region to draw in great powers, and great power competition. This is in part because of resource booms in the region, political crusades that might originate in, say, the USA, Europe, or increasingly the Middle East, um, as well as security concerns, sometimes which are in response to quite temporary or fleeting issues. These all tend to be drivers of intervention. Um, Now, the region can become an actual battleground when you get overlaps between internal conflicts among the states of the Horn. You start seeing attempts at mutual destabilization by regional states, and when you get international rivalries being overlaid on top of that, and when these overlap, that's when things can really escalate. At present, these are some of these ingredients are in place, although the overlap is an imperfect one, let's say. Thanks.
Thanks. And Edward on Al-Shabaab.
So thank you very much. So in short, I would indeed class Al-Shabaab as an increasing threat, although this is not without caveats. So as mentioned, by the end of 2025, Al-Shabaab had overturned most of the government's gains from the landmark 2022 to 2023 offensive. So the group has retaken key towns in central Somalia and some areas close to the capital. In doing so, it has relinked its presence in central Somalia to its heartland in southern Somalia. On the other side, the FGS and its allies are also very much under strain, so including over, firstly, as discussed by Dan, the electoral reforms. So ahead of the elections, which are due by May 2026, the FGS plans to change the electoral model from an indirect system to universal suffrage, and that's been met by resistance from opposition politicians, but also Puntland and Jubaland for various reasons. But essentially, this issue has diverted attention from the conflict with Al-Shabaab and also undermined cooperation with local militias. Secondly, external support, so including financing from the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission in Somalia, is in decline or at least doubt, and this weakens the capacity to hold and win back territory, and might also lead to more potentially volatile bilateral interventions in the country, instead of those operating through a more multilateral security framework. And thirdly, the Somali National Army, which continues to suffer from weak logistics, insufficient training, and poor leadership. I would just highlight, though, on the other hand, that Al-Shabaab has faced stiff opposition, with government forces notably beating back insurgents south of Mogadishu between August and October 2025, and that despite its advances, Al-Shabaab remains largely confined to rural and peripheral areas. Whereas the government remains in control of major cities, which Al-Shabaab does not appear to have the strength and popular tolerance to seize and hold. But sort of on the bottom line, Al-Shabaab's battlefield position is better than it was at the start of 2025, and the group does appear to be gaining momentum. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Edward. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got about half a dozen questions in the hopper, as it were. So I'm going to take a number and see how far we go with those. There's one question here from Ramadan Musa. What is the role of Eritrea and Djibouti in the ongoing regional conflict? There are two questions related, I think. Antonio Ribeiro is asking, can you talk about the position of Western shipping nations, maritime nations, I assume, and their potential intervention? What form would it take? What are the thresholds of Western involvement beyond maritime surveillance and security support to their nation's vessels? And possibly related to that, Eleftherios Vergetsis asks, given the unprecedented concentration of foreign military bases in the Horn, discuss, to what extent is this securitization of the coastline or in stabilizing against piracy, or is it fueling new regional scramble for coastal state sovereignty and therefore also fueling smuggling and arms networks, I think. And one on from Alex Sanchez. What is the attitude of the general Somali population towards Somaliland and its quest for independence? What do people-to-people relations amount to? So I think, shall we go in, I think, the same order as we went before. I don't know if Wolf Christian wants to pick up those of the questions that he would like to deal with, Dan, and then Edward, if he's got any thoughts. I think particularly on the Somali public opinion question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, it's a really interesting question about what Western shipping nations are interested in doing. I think the main point we are trying to make in this report is that we cannot resolve the piracy crisis on sea alone, right? If we look at what has been done since the beginning of the piracy crisis, which of course by now was more than 20 years ago, is we have the best management practices, so attempts of the shipping industry to protect their ships better by having security protocols and possibly armed guards. We have an enhanced maritime presence off the coast of Somalia, right? For a while, there was a fairly large number of sort of foreign warships off the coast of Somalia. Now that was during the peak of Somali piracy, so yeah, quite a while ago by now. You have, of course, training efforts on land in Somalia with its many political constituencies, Somaliland, Puntland, and South Central, basically, and the attempt to create coast guards, maritime police forces, and such like. So that's basically the three elements of the response. If we look at warships, the European Union Naval Force Atalanta, which has a long-standing sort of EU contribution to maritime security in these waters, is basically down to one warship, has been down to one warship for a very long time. And in fact, prior to this crisis, prior to 2023, there was serious discussion about maybe closing the mission because there was a feeling that the warships are needed elsewhere more urgently. They got a new lease on life, basically because of the crisis in the Red Sea, I would say, more than the piracy dynamic. But the overall question for Western shipping nations is, do we really care sufficiently? And I think the answer is no. Right. I don't see Western shipping nations getting involved in more sustained efforts to stabilize Somalia. And that's really what it would take, because you can't resolve this issue on the sea. Again, yes, we can send additional 2 warships as we find them in order to assist the more ships in need, and that would undoubtedly be welcomed by the shipping community and arguably the Somali government. But it doesn't resolve the root causes. The root causes have to do with what Edward and Dan have been discussing. The 30 years of strife, more than 30 years of strife in Somalia, political fragmentation, and of course regional politics, where regional powers are basically are competing for influence, ports, bases, and all of that, which I think is the next question. So I think the outlook is actually sadly fairly negative, because the time where you make a sustained investment in state building, for lack of a better word, in Somalia is over, right? I mean, the US has made it very clear under the Donald Trump White House that nation building is not something we're willing to engage in. It's costly, messy, and often doesn't work. I mean, I think we agree with that analysis, is that it's messy, costly, and often doesn't work. And the European Union, beyond what they're already doing, and they're unlikely to do a lot more than that. The African Union who has been carrying a lot of the burden militarily in recent years in Somalia, relies actually on the Europeans and the North Americans to fund this exercise, something which we haven't been discussing. So I mean, they've been in a sustained funding crisis ever since the beginning of 2025, which raises question about how long they can keep doing it. And who else is there, right? Yes, some other nations are being more active. So the Indian Navy, for example, has been a lot more active during this current crisis than in previous years. But I don't really see any appetite for a more sustained engagement, which would arguably be necessary to really resolve the root causes of piracy. Let's put it this way.
Thank you. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll try my best for the public perceptions question, which is again a bit of a thorny issue. I'm not aware of any systematic research on this question, but I would definitely be curious to see what this is. What I can say is that the debate has tended to be defined by its extremes a little, and even if there are some quite strongly held positions, either way, I don't know for sure if some of the, say, opinions that have been expressed in recent weeks are that representative of overall sentiments. There will, of course, be people in either region who diverge from their government's position as well. Now, in the last few weeks, there have been efforts by Mogadishu to try and mobilize demonstrations um, against Somaliland over the following the Israeli recognition, and these have not really worked. There hasn't been significant attendance at these, as I understand it, which would indicate either that public or at least urban sentiment is not as strong as Mogadishu would hope, and or that there is a reluctance to be swept along with the current the presidency's political agenda. In terms of the question about Eritrea and Djibouti, I mean, both countries have reacted quite strongly against the Israeli recognition of Somaliland. Um, in the Eritrea is probably the more critical one to watch here because it also has a growing dispute with Ethiopia that risk becoming a militarized dispute as well. Th this this is feeding into some of the narratives around a potential UAE Saudi kind of rivalry with both states dragging in an array of parties in which Eritrea would feature presumably prominently on the Saudi side in this hypothetical arrangement. As I say, this to me is would be particularly concerning because this has the potential at least to shift problems from the Gulf into the Horn of Africa in ways that drag Eritrea and Ethiopia closer to conflict and risk causing ripple effects across the region. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Edward. I don't know if you have anything wanted to add to the.
I could perhaps just give some final words just for the last minute on ISSP. So I would just highlight that, as mentioned, by late 2025, the group suffered severe operational setbacks, and compared to 2024, when the group expelled Al-Shabaab from parts of Basaso and controlled key revenue streams, its territorial and operational reach is now markedly reduced. But I would also highlight concerning the group that despite heavy losses, it hasn't been eliminated, so reports do indicate continued attacks in previously cleared areas and the survival of senior leaders. And also, it's relying on operating in difficult mountainous terrain, integrating into local communities, and also the use of foreign fighters, which makes its eradication more challenging. So, just overall, it's been significantly degraded but not defeated. The group currently poses a localized and contained threat that's confined to Puntland. However, its resilience and its transnational linkages, and also the possibility that Puntland's campaign will wind down, so particularly in the face of some of the political disputes that have been touched by Dan, could create conditions for gradual reconstitution. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Edward. And as you hinted, we are up against our scheduled cut-off time. There are a number of questions in the queue, and unfortunately, I don't think we can get round to those. I apologise to those who intervened, that we didn't get round to your questions, but I think we've had a very good discussion for which, I think those of you who have contributed questions to the debate, but particularly to our panelists, Edward, Wolf Christian, and to Dan. Thank you all very much. Thanks for taking part, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and there will be a recording of this, the proceedings here, on our website in the not too distant future. So with that, I will draw proceedings to a close. Thank you very much.